9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainstorm. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 26. The Last Moment. The Stitchbunk Coven raced through the rocky field, taking care to keep together so they don't lose one another. Dead brown grass surrounded them and made it difficult to find the way out of the field. The clan crept quickly through the ocean of grass, rock, and trees, the torrential downpour soaking their favorite skin. The machine was struggling to catch up behind them. The tightly spaced rocks and trees made it difficult for the immense metallic monster to get the Stitchpunks. It couldn't circle around in the field of the barrens, or else it would lose them in the remains of once beautiful forest. So it continued forward, its shrieks of fury echoing in the air around them, ripping trees and rocks aside. 9 looked over his shoulder at the machine, its single crimson eye illuminating the night. He knew that he needed to lure it away from the others and into the field and destroy it before his strength was completely gone. Each step weakened him as his side throbbed intensely. His entire body screamed with the pain that he simply couldn't ignore any longer. 9 knew he was pushing himself to the absolute limit, but he wouldn't allow anything to stop him. As he glanced at the machine again, 9 noticed something dripping off one of his claws as it swung it into the tree, snapping the trunk in half, splinters flying everywhere. It was thicker than water and had a distinct spine to it. His eye widened as he realized the machine was dripping with oil. The box had crushed next to the citadel. It must have contained an oil barrel. 9 suddenly slipped into a small patch of mud. He tried to keep his balance, but his trembling knees gave out from underneath him. 9 collapsed to the ground into a small pool. The poor male Stitchpunk cried out and struggled to get back to his feet. The light staff dropped from his hands into dead grass. 9 knew if he couldn't get back to his feet this one last time, then he would never again. Suddenly, someone was by his side, armed around him and trying to heave him up to his feet.
"Come on, 9.
5's deep, familiar voice wavered in and out of focus.
"Come on. You can do it. We've got to get up. Come on,"
he encouraged, pulling 9 up out of the mud and dirt and to his unsteady feet. 9 shook his head, dazed and dizzy. The machine screamed as it spotted the 2 Stitchpunks, struggling to crawl over a small chasm that blocked its way. 9 gasped sharply and slung 9's arm over his shoulder, trying to help him back to his feet and back to the others. 9, however, pulled himself out of 5's grasp and dug his feet into the dirt. "Wait," 9 said, looking up at the machine. It was still trapped and screeching furiously as sparks issued from around its eye and were extinguished by the rain. 9 then knew exactly what he had to do. 5 stopped walking as 9 abruptly pulled himself away and halted to look up at the machine. He reached for 9's head and tried to get him to continue walking.
"Come on, 9. The machine is going to come after us any second. We've got to get back to the
5 said urgently, but was abruptly cut off by 9 yanking his hand fiercely from his own. 5 withdrew, shocked at his friend's sudden actions. The younger man sighed and looked up. His face crumbled into a heartbreaking expression. He knew that, in this moment, he was going to say goodbye to his best friend for the second time. However, he took relief in knowing this time 5 was alive and was going to be safe. He walked over to the older Stitchpunk, clasping his shoulder tightly.
5.
9 began, closing his eyes for a moment and sighed before continuing. He had known this goodbye was coming for days, but he hadn't prepared himself for just how painful it was. However, he knew he didn't have much time. 9 took a deep breath before continuing, looking directly into 5's single eye.
Get everyone out of here. Keep them hidden and keep them safe. When this is over, take them home.
9 said softly but urgently.
I can distract it and fight it off until you guys get out of here. I might be able to weaken the machine enough for where I can destroy it before I...
9 trailed off, closing his eyes and bending his head. 5's eye wondered as he finally realized what he was saying, what he had been planning to do ever since he had rescued him from the Citadel.
That's why you wouldn't let me heal you. You think you're gonna die?
5 cried, suddenly realizing 9's true intentions. He looked away, his features contorted in a pain both physical and emotional. He had never wanted 5 to leave him again, or he 5. Nevertheless, the only way they would ever be truly safe was to destroy the fabrication machine, which was still trying to struggle through the chasm. 9 then looked up at 5, struggling to keep a hold on his emotions. Please, keep them safe. I know you can do it. Our mission will be fulfilled, and the world will be safe for us, 9 said as he began to turn away. However, 5 was quick to grab 9's shoulder and keep him still, looking intensely into his eyes.
You don't have to do this. You don't have to die. You can't. You're my best friend. And I made a promise. A promise, 9. Don't you leave him. And I don't mean to. I don't mean to.
5's voice broke. 9 sighed sadly, reaching up and taking 5's hand in his own, clasping them tightly. 5 shook his head lightly, his lower lip quivering. 5, you are my best friend. I will always be with you, like you were for me. But I have to end this war. For you all, and for the sake of this world, I will do whatever it takes to keep my family safe. Trust me, it'll be all right, 9 said softly, begging 5 to understand. The two shared a long gaze before the poor, one-eyed ragdoll pulled the younger into a tight embrace. Giving a cry of grief, 9 hugged his back, shutting his eyes tightly and digging his fingers into 5's shoulder. In those moments, he felt as if he had never loved his best friend more. He felt as if his heart was shattered. It wasn't fair, but it had to be done. The war must end. The 9 pushed 5's shoulders, pulling him into a desperate grasp. 5 grasped up at him, his lower lips trembling, his arms sliding from his shoulders. He then saw 9 was clutching something in his hand, a match from his pack. 5 looked from the match to his 9's face. He looked back at him, his gaze intense. With the final look, he said his final goodbye to 5 before. A huge column of rock was groaning, crashing down to the earth. The fabrication machine had pulverized the stone outcropping in order to get to the stitch punks. The deafening crash echoed throughout the barrens as the column of rock fell straight towards 9 and 5. Before the older of the two could overcome his panic and shock and do a single thing, 9 grabbed his shoulders and acted as quickly as his weak body possibly could. Gathering the very last ounce of strength, 9 shoved 5 with as much force as he could muster. The healer was pinched forward with a cry, stumbling into the dirt and grass as the column of stone crashed to the ground. 9 stumbled backwards, thrown into the air as the rocks shook into the ground. It completely blocked the narrow passage of the chasm. 9 landed on his back, groaning as another jolt of pain shot through his body, forcing himself to open his eyes. He saw that he was now separated from the other Stitch Punks, who were on the other side of the pillar.
9!
He heard 5 shriek his name in horror. He allowed himself to sigh of relief, for that meant 5 was all right, in the safe, on the other side of the blockage. He couldn't answer 5 as the fabrication machine towered over him, glaring at him with a single crimson eye. The light bounced and reflected off the raindrop patterings in its metallic body. 9 acted as quickly as he possibly could, grabbing the light staff and the match, overcame with an intense, overpowering determination. 9 managed to get his feet underneath him and waved the glowing light staff at the fabrication machine, immediately catching its attention.
This way! Follow me!
9 shouted, running through a small, narrow opening that led to an immense, vast field of the barrens. These fields were covered in short, dead grass, trees, and rocks dotting the way until everything blended into the mists of the mountains so very far away. The machine shrieked and immediately followed, easily climbing over the rock outcroppings and onto the field, dragging its enormous body behind itself. 9 saw that everywhere it walked, oil dripped from the underside of its body. Good. That meant his plan would hopefully work. As he entered the slightly taller grass, 9's tan fabric skin blended easily with the dead plant life. As he quickly ducked down behind a rock, the machine screamed as it lost its prey in the field. 9 waited to strike the match until the machine passed very close to him. He struck it again. The rock he was hiding behind shielded it with his hands against the rain. He mustered up his quickly worn strength, ignoring the throbbing of his shoulder, threw a flame at the machine, and watched as it screamed in agony as fire immediately engulfed it. 9 then tightened his fist around his staff, feeling the cool metal underneath his fingertips. He bowed his head, leaning against the rock, and taking a moment to think about his coven. He wished he had a chance to say goodbye, but he knew that they wouldn't allow him to do this. His fist clenched his light staff as he exhaled slowly. This was the only way. Opening his eyes once more, he got to his feet, already missing them terribly. He began to run through the burning field. It broke his very soul to know he was never going to be able to see them again, to tell them what they meant to him and how sorry he was for everything. The searing pain that coursed through his body didn't slow him as he struggled through the fire. The fabrication machine, the monster, was screeching as the fire engulfed it, and every place it had dripped oil, curling the grass. It too strong for the fire alone to kill it. But 9 hoped it was injured bad enough to where he could finally end this. No! An agonizing, familiar voice rang out. He turned in shock and surprise as a force slammed into him and brought him spiraling towards the ground painfully. Looking up, he found himself staring into the blazing eyes of 7. "Are you insane?" she yelled, as she grasped his arm and yanked him roughly to his feet. His injuries made him wince, but his decision was not wavered. 5 must have immediately gone to her, knowing that she was the only person who could possibly stop him. She could easily get over the blockage of the chasm and get to him. 9 turned away from her, looking back at the enraged fabrication machine. "I have to kill it," 9 said, his hands tightened around the staff. 7 grabbed his arm, her fingers tight. He looked down at her in surprise. No, you're too hurt. Let me, or let five do it. Please, just not you. She pleaded, looking back into his eyes, pulling him closer to her. He inhaled slowly and exhaled the same, studying her beautiful face. He struck the light staff into the ground and took her hands in his, squeezing tightly. He looked at her soft expression. I'm not risking any of you. It's got to be me. It's my fault that this thing is still alive. This war needed to end, and I need to be the one to do it, he replied, his voice barely audible over the roaring fire. He said this so softly, Seven stirred up in him in disbelief, shaking her head. No, Nine, we can't lose you. I can't lose you. Nine, please. Seven protested, holding fast to his hands. Nine sighed, bowing his head and closing his eyes. This was it. He was saying goodbye to the woman he loved. Opening his eyes, he pulled her closer, needing to bid farewell to the person who, no matter what, had always believed him. I will protect you. I'm not going to risk any of you ever again. You all are going to get out of here, and you can live your lives the way it was intended. Nine said softly. Seven just tightened her grip, her voice faltering, straining with the emotion that was slipping through her shield. What about you? I nearly lost you once. Please don't leave us, Seven begged, staring hard at him, into his eyes. Grief and devastation overcame her at the thought of losing him. Seven, I need you to stay. You and Five, you must protect them. Protect them all for me, he said, pleading, looking into her eyes as well. Squeezing her hands tightly, she bent her head, unable to match his gaze, her heart compressing painfully. I can't lose you, Nine, she whispered, bringing their intertwined hands into her chest where her heart lay. Nine felt her heartbeat, and he furrowed his brow and leaned towards her and looked intensely into her eyes, his own unfathomable. You are strong, Seven. You are strong, and your strength will protect them when I can't, he said softly, but fiercely. Seven shook her head, staring up at him again. Her lower lip trembled as she leaned towards him. Please don't leave me, she pleaded. Agony invaded in her face and her eyes. Nine could only give a small shake of his head. He couldn't bear to see her, nor any of the others, killed by the machine again. He needed to end the war and free the others from the threat of the machines. He wished Seven could understand that. He wished Seven could understand that he loved her with his very soul and would never, ever leave her. Bending his head, he leaned forward and gently touched the tips of his optics with hers in goodbye. He pressed back. Her breathing trembled. The two stood there for a few moments in time, rain soaking their fabric bodies. He then withdrew from her slowly, slightly, and picking up his staff from the ground. In the spider beast attack, the monster had torn the leather strap from Nine's back, and the pen blade was lost. But he didn't care. He wouldn't need it any longer. He gently pressed the light staff into Nine's hand, curled her fingers around it. Seven's hand. He then reached behind her and grabbed her spear from the ground. The look she gave him broke his heart. Nine merely leaned back towards her and again touched her optics with his. He closed his eyes, using his free hand to clutch hers tightly, bringing it to his lips and giving her hand the lightest kiss. Seven's only reaction was to squeeze his hand even tighter. He inhaled and exhaled slowly, knowing that this was it, the last time he would ever see her. He withdrew, taking a step away from her. 9, Seven whispered, still clinging tightly to his hands. He compressed her hand back, reassuringly and warmly. "It will be okay," he said, so softly she nearly didn't hear him. "Don't be afraid." Before she knew it, he tore himself away from her, fists tightening around her spear, and went to meet his greatest enemy in the world. Seven watched him as he disappeared into the inferno. Her eyes snapped as she decided against everything she went for, and ran after him, dodging flames her skull had pulled over her face. 9 had taken her spear so he would have a piece of Seven with him when he died. He wanted her to hold the light to keep the others' hopes up, knowing they would never fall into the darkness again. He faced the fabrication machine, no longer afraid. Fury rushed through him, igniting a fire within him that fueled his incentive to destroy the monster once and for all. It burned in his crest, an inferno that surrounded his heart. The monster he hated looked down at him, bathing him in the blood of red light. With flaming claws, it reached out and tried to grab him, tried to crush him, but he evaded them, remembering what Seven had taught him. He had to clench his jaw as he faltered, nearly falling. 9 knew that he was losing his race against time. He only needed to hold on for a little bit longer, wait until the machine was weak enough. Suddenly, his left knee collapsed beneath him as he stumbled. One burning claw tripped him, sending him spiraling into the ground. The pain sheared through him as he lay on his chest, struggling to breathe, his limbs shaking. He tried to heave himself to his feet as the claw was raised high in the air. 9's knees shook as he tried to stand. Each breath he took was more like a gasp. As soon as 9 regained his footing, standing on trembling knees, the fabrication machine swept the white-hot claw into him. He flew backwards, crumbling to the ground. 9's side gave another surge of excruciating pain once again, so terribly that he screamed involuntarily. He lay on the ground imply, unable to move, as he felt as if every fiber in his being was broken. As his eyesight began to waver in and out of focus rapidly, white lines cutting his vision, he realized that his right optic was broken. He tried to breathe, but each breath sent excruciating pain through his chest. He couldn't take this much longer. The machine towered above him, glaring at the limp, broken ragdoll. Reaching forward, and with one enormous iron claw, it clutched the tiny, delicate waist of the ragdoll, lifting him into the air slowly, looking him with loathing. Reaching up with another claw, it grasped the minute zipper upon his chest and pulled down roughly, reaching inside his limp body. He could not move or stop it. The 2 notes from the scientist flew out of his chest and into the air. They drifted down into the slowly dying fire, where they burned into scorching embers and finally became meaningless ash. 9 left the claws reaching inside of him, closed around the talisman and bring it out of his body. Panic immediately overtook him. If he got the talisman, if he go after the Coven, and the war would start all over again, and he would lose. He would lose them. Gathering the last of his strength, 9 managed to raise Seven's spear over his head. He thrust it into the joints of the claw that held him tightly and painfully by the wrist. The machine shrieked and recoiled, releasing his wrist and dropping 9. He fell to the earth below him, landing on his chest. Air flew out of him. Nine lay motionless on the ground, winded, staring at the fire. He was broken, crumbled, paralyzed. He could only try to breathe and blink. The pain overtook his frail body. Every time he managed to breathe, it felt like razor-sharp needles were being shoved into his chest, sending fire down his side and throughout his whole body. His consciousness ebbed. Black mist swirled at the edges of his mind, threatening to drag him down for the last time. The machine above him roared in triumph as he had held the talisman into its eye. Retribution would soon be within its grasp, as would 9 life-giving souls. 9 managed to lift his head and looked up the machine towering above him. He placed his hands underneath him and pushed against the ground as hard as he could. His arms were shaking violently, grasping shallowly, feeling like there was a burning band of iron closing around his chest. Everything was so dark, his vision of beginning to fade, able to see nothing but blurred shapes. He could barely see through his broken optic. The machine no more than screaming mound, a dark, evil mountain, standing tall above the fire. It had the talisman, but also the heart. Everything was wavering in front of him, making him dizzy. The world seemed to dim in sound except for the strenuous, trembling breathing. He was fading fast, and it needed to be done. He needed to finish this war as the life slowly ebbed away from him, slipping through his fingers like water, fading away from each feeble, futile beat of his heart. 9 knew that he was dying. He was finally standing on trembling knees, reaching down and wrapping his fingers around the hilt of the spear. He clutched his zipper and zipped himself up, almost unconsciously doing so. He was in a different state of mind. Another world, almost. His one and only priority was to kill the fabrication machine and save his coven. In those moments, he thought of nothing else but pain, not the pain nor the fire. His entire form was numb, his thoughts and memories rushing someplace else. He knew he would soon follow. Through the misty darkness, he found the faces of his clan, the people he loved, the memories he would hold onto until his final breath. His fingers tightened around the hilt of the spear. He began to run, summoning every single ounce of remaining exhausted strength he had left. 9 could feel his heart pounding furiously, trying to keep him alive as he rushed towards the machine. It loomed closer and closer, the final moments closing in. 9 then raised his spear high above his head, feeling all of his hatred and anger flow through him into the blade. He threw his body forward, nearly colliding with a metallic monster before it had a chance to react. The razor-sharp blade pierced the orb. A flash of bright light flooded the area as 9 plunged the spear deep through the orb. Its phosphoric radiance illuminated his face and blinded him, but he kept his fingers in death grip, pushing the blade through the orb, throwing all of his weight into the hilt. He was yelling out of pain and triumph as the fabrication machine shrieked piercingly above him. He only pushed the blade as far as he could into the orb, his limbs shaking violently. Immediately, glowing blue lines began to creep up from the cracking orb into the machine's body. It shrieked as its strange, jagged lines left melting and warping metal in their wake. 9 kept pushing the blade until it could go no further. His face was twisted in agony, the pain blinding him. He felt as if he was being ripped apart, his very soul set on fire. Then the machine reached down with a single spindly arm, and the claws locked themselves around his waist. He cried out as his feet were swept out from underneath him. The fabrication machine lifted himself from the ground, glaring at him maliciously. The blade slid out of the orb, cracking and dripping with glowing bright blue energy. Nine's fingers still tight on the staff. However, he was very weak, and the blade slid through his fingers, falling to the earth far below with a clang. Nine's head slumped against his shoulders. Unable to keep up any longer, he blinked in the brightness, squinting. Every single ounce of his strength was gone. The poor young man was exhausted and could no longer move. He merely lay in the clutches of the machine. Raindrops darkened his cheek, running down them like tears. The pounding of his heart, each final beat, seemed feeble, and his breathing was ragged. The blue lines crept up the machine's body, slowly wrapping themselves around its large metallic structure. Its entire body trembled violently. The strange blue lights creeped up its body from the destroyed orb, jagged like streaks of lightning. It began to literally fall apart at the seams, wires melting and shooting sparks as they were ripped apart. The deadly lights were creeping towards the brain itself, slowly destroying the monster from the inside out. It was swiftly dying as the spy machine had. With a shivering claw, it raised the talisman towards Nine. It knew it was going to be destroyed. There was no escaping the inevitable. However, it was not going down without bringing one wretched soul with it. The talisman was turned upside down as it held it up to Nine's face. He didn't scream or struggle, staring quietly at the device. Nine had finished their mission, and the war was over now. There was no escape from the machine, and he knew that it was it. His short life was over. He found himself thinking of his kinsmen now. In the end of all things, each of their faces lingered in his memories, smiling and happy. He blinked again at the symbols glowing the familiar bright green. The talisman ruptured open, electricity cracking around it. Nine tensed slightly, then relaxed inside. He was going to miss them. He was going to miss them all terribly. But they were alive and protected. He closed his eyes slowly, resting his head upon his shoulders. Nine finally stopped fighting. He was fading. The world around him darkened. He could feel a soft pulling. It wasn't physical, or even mental. It was something beyond everything. Something wrapped itself around him, through him, and lifted his weightless body. Nine's sense left him as he took his last sudden breath. He knew that this was the end, and yet he wasn't afraid. His family was safe, and that was all that mattered. The war was over now. He was going to quietly accept death in knowing that he had finally done the right thing. There was a roar, like rushing wind. Something struck him jaggedly, and for a mere moment in time, it floated inside of him like a breathing of life. Then he felt the pain. It was beyond all imagination, so intense he could hardly register, beyond everything of comprehension, something that wasn't of reality. He knew that the three deadly lights were stealing away his soul. Then, as the end of the experience drew near, Nine was able to hope that they would forgive him for what he had done, and that they would live out their lives, finally safe, finally free. And then, it all went black, and he knew no more. Seven stopped running through the field, her eyes wide in horror. The machine had Nine in its grasp, staring down. He didn't struggle or scream, but lay there limply, He had finally given up the fight. He was going to accept his fate. The machine raised the quivering talisman to him. The eerie green glow illuminated his face. The light, however, was upside down, and instead of entering his frail body through his eyes, it pierced him through his mouth and the space between his neck and the zipper where his heart lay. No! Seven screamed, reaching out towards her friend. She could only stand frozen in shock as she watched 9 die before her. No! Outside the field, the seven others watched and could see the scene in horror.
No! No! No!
5 screamed, trying to rush into the field, trying to somehow get to 9, but 1 quickly held him back by the shoulders. He struggled fiercely, the older man grabbing his arm and clenching tightly, pulling him back.
There's nothing you can do, 5. He's gone!
He shouted. 5, overcame by grief, continued to try to pull away from 1. Finally, he managed to break away, sprinting forward until 2 wrapped his arms around 5's chest, tightly holding him away from the monster. 5 felt the comforting grasp of his mentor and stopped fighting. 2 released the younger man while 5 continued to scream, dropping down to his knees in the dirt.
No! 9! No! 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 No!
He cried, breaking down into heavy sobs. His body was shaking violently. He could only scream.
No!
Again, as the light withdrew from his best friend's body back into the talisman, 5 felt nothing but anguish as he sat to the ground, bent over as his cries of agony filled the air. 2 sank down beside him, looking at the dying monster with misery as 5 continued to sob uncontrollably. His best friend was gone. The others stood frozen, horrified, the twins burying their faces into their hands, unable to watch as the light snapped into the talisman. Back in the field, the thin blue lines had finally unfolded the machine completely. It began to shake violently, and then it exploded. A flash of crackling cyan light filled the air. The very earth seemed to shake as the machine was destroyed. Its immense body was ruptured inside out. The scientist's creation finally meeting its ultimate demise. The fabrication machine's lifeless body toppled into the ground. Piece by piece, it was soon engulfed in ravenous flames, never to fight again, or another day. The talisman in 9's lifeless form fell from its claws and disappeared into the smoke and flames. 9 darted across the field, rushing towards the mound of melting metal. It was once the machine. The rain still poured heavily, making the fire worse. 9 tried to avoid the flames, the inferno licking eerily at her fabric skin. She finally reached out into the clearing where the machine had fallen, along with 9. 7 stopped abruptly in the damped earth as the black smoke from the fire swirling around her. She panted as she whirled around in all directions, her eyes ranking the space around her, desperately searching for 9. Finally, through the thick, suffocating smoke, she saw him. He was lying on his side, still, a thin line of ribbon-like gray smoke raising from his body. No! No! She whispered as she ran to 9, dropping to her knees beside him. Embers fell to the ground as the grass curled under the flames. The crackle and popping sound of the wood as the trees were devoured by the ever-ravenous inferno echoed through the air. With trembling hands, 7 turned him to lie on his back. She gave a strangled cry as she looked upon him. His eyes were closed instead of forever staring and seeing nothing. The light instead had pierced through his chest, and a smoking hole was burned through the smoldering blackened burlap. 9 was dead. 7 cried out softly, laying her shaking hands over his chest. She then looked up, trying to see through the fire. She wasn't going to let his cold body burn up into the meaningless ash. He didn't deserve that. 7 picked him up, wrapping her arms around his torso and pulling her skullmet over her face. 9's body slumped over, still dragged along the ground. 7 was weak and was unable to lift him into her shoulders. She tried to walk through the fire, but soon drained away the last of her strength. Suddenly, she gave a shout as the soft, wet ground beneath her feet unexpectedly gave way. She had walked forward into a shallow soldier's trench, the sides steep. 7 was thrown forward, 9's body falling from her grasp as she fell. A razor-sharp piece of shrapnel sunk out from the side of the trench. It tore through her arm, right over the scar where the cat beast had injured her. 7 screamed in pain as she landed on the ground, clutching her arm. The rain soaked her at where she sat, trying to overcome the pain. Looking up, she saw where she had dropped 9. No longer able to walk, she crawled over to him, keeping her torn arm to her chest. The pain, both in her arm and in her heart, blinding her. She began to succumb to weakness, something she was never supposed to ever allow. But her heart had changed. 9 had come into her life and made her see who she was. But now 9 has suddenly gone. He had left her forever. 7 coughed, trembling. The rain caused dark and ash-filled streaks to run from underneath her optics and down her cheeks. This horror, shock, and devastation crumbled her shield like a huge, unmerciful army invading a fortress. 7 lay beside 9, wrapping her uninjured arm around him, protecting him as best as she could. If she was to die, then she would die beside him, and wouldn't have it any other way. Sudden warmth, not like fire, was on her shoulder, and strong, familiar arms were underneath her, lifting her from the ground. 9's body slid out of her own arms, and she was too weak to hold on to him any longer.
It's okay. It's all right.
5 consoled her as he carried 7 out of the field. She panted, dazed and confused. The sky above was inky black, rain pouring down in the night. 7 curled into the arms that held her, trembling with shock and grief.
Get him! Get him! Don't leave him there!
She screamed, trying to look around and unsure they didn't leave 9 behind.
We're getting him. We are,
5 said, his voice trembling as he cradled 7 against his chest. Blessed cool soaked her body, and she was thankful for the relief from the burns on her white fabric. As 7 stared at the dying fire, seeing the grass curled under the Inferno's command, she saw 2 indistinct shapes appearing through the thick smoke and ash. 5 finally laid her down on the ground, and she curled up to her side, breathing heavily. 5 stroked her shoulder, speaking softly to her, trying to calm the traumatized woman. She barely heard what he said as she saw 8 and 6 emerge from the fire. 6 was trembling violently. His eyes widened with shock and fright. 8 wore an expression 7 had never seen him wear. It was grief, but bewilderment etched within the sorrow. as he looked down upon the lifeless body he held gently in his arms. 9! Seven screamed hoarsely as she scrambled to her feet, throwing 5's hand from her shoulder, as 8 lowered 9's body to the ground. 6 was carrying the two staffs, laying them alongside him. 6 pushed past him as she dropped. 7 pushed past him as she dropped to her knees beside 9. No! No! She breathed, her hands shaking. 7 wrapped her arms around his body and lifted him into her lap. Bending over, her entire form trembled as she looked into the emotionless face. His eyes were closed tightly, lips slightly parted. There was a dark, deep burn right through the fabric between his neck and zipper. Some of his collar was burned away, leaving charred, blackened fabric and burlap. The small circular mechanical box that severed his heart showed through the burn. The metal slightly blackened. It no longer made the familiar pounding, ticking beat that signified life. 9 merely lay in 7's lap, his head resting in her hands. 7's heart was hard and protected. Her emotions were encased in a tight blockade, never to be released. But 9, her dearest friend, was lying in her arms, lifeless and growing colder by the minute. Right then and there, her hard heart broke clean and true. 9 was gone, and just a glimmer of hope had broken through the war the Stitchpunks fought. He was taken away from them in a mere instant in time. 7 couldn't help but her emotions locked within her, especially the feelings for the young man lying in her lap. 7 bowed her head, wrapping her arms around 9 and touching his forehead to his. She let go, and she did something a warrior never was supposed to do. 7 began to cry. Crying was a sign of weakness, and a warrior was not allowed to show weakness. However, 7 didn't care. All she cared about was her best friend. Her 9, lying lifeless in the earth, and no amount of pleading could bring him back. The clan stared on, horrified and heartbroken. 5 walked forward, reaching out to the trembling hand. 9, 5 whispered before he sank to his knees beside 9 and 7. Looking into 9's quiet face, he bent his hand. He closed his eyes and began to cry, his shoulders heaving as he sobbed. 7 wept in anguish, tightening her grip on 9 and burying her face in his shoulder. He had left her alone in the world. He was never coming back. 2 covered his eyes and sank to his knees, crying softly. 1 stood still, staring at 9 with an unfathomable expression of sadness. He took off his crown and bowed his head. 8, who had his arms around both 1 and 6, bowed his head, his lower lip quivering. 6 covered his eyes with his hands, trembling from the cold and with grief. 3 and 4 had crept over to sit under 9's legs. 4 was flickering slowly, feebly, as he reached out and touched 9's knee. He immediately withdrew as he felt the deathly cold underneath his fingers. 4 stood, shook his head lightly in shock, then bent over and covered his eyes with his hands, sobbing hard, while 3 held his brother close, rocking him back and forth. He buried his face into 4's shoulder, crying as they sat beside the Stitchpunk that had been like their elder brother. 9, 7 whispered his name in anguish as if she could call him back, but nothing would. He had gone where she couldn't call him back. His soul was trapped inside the talisman. Everything that was, his strength, his kindness, his bravery was gone. The strong Stitchpunk that had been so full of life had been ripped away from her. The darkness of night seemed to engulf Seven, and she tightened her arms around him, rocking Nine gently. Five reached up and grasped her shoulder, rubbing it reassuringly. Seven didn't care who tried to comfort her. She didn't care who saw her cry. All she wanted was her Nine back. Two then hobbled forward slowly and bent down to Seven and Five. He rubbed her back, and his faint voice barely reached her hearing sensors as she looked up at him. Her hearing and her sight seemed blur. Her body was shutting down, weakened from the grief and fire. The flickering inferno was quickly engulfing itself, and it ran out of things to burn. "We must go home," he said, lifting his hands and brushing away the rain that streaked down her cheeks. She looked at him for a moment before turning her gaze back, down to Nine. She stroked his cheeks before gently lowering him to the ground, keeping a hand behind his head. Everything was quiet for a moment as she gazed into his peaceful face, bending her head. Seven gave a rattled sigh, closing her eyes. Her body swayed as she passed out from sheer, unrelenting anguish. As she fell backwards, Five caught her body and eased her down to the ground, where she laid beside Nine. All was silent for a moment while Five looked up at his coven without being asked, without anyone saying anything. Eight stepped forward. He bent down before the three Stitchpunks and reached out, gently scooping up the unconscious woman in his strong arms. He held her tenderly, for his hard heart had changed as well. Eight turned away, rain dripping off his shoulder pads, as Five gratefully patted his arm. One joined Eight by his side, and as he led the others out of the field, the other Stitchpunks began to follow him. Five watched them as they walked away before looking back down at the body of his best friend. He could only stare down at Nine for a moment, his lower lip trembling. He simply couldn't believe that Nine was taken away from him in a single instant. He was gone forever. Reaching forward, Five wrapped his arms around Nine's shoulder and lifted him from the ground. Nine's head slumped over, resting against Five's crest. He looked miserably down at the motionless Stitchpunk, limp and lifeless in his arms. His best friend, his brother, was gone too. Gone. Just like that. His crest felt as if he was being cleaved open with grief. Five loved him with all his heart, and in a blink of an eye he was dead. With a quiet cry, Five bent his head and held Nine closely, his shoulders shaking as he wept, mourning his little brother. Two had paused for a moment, watching his son in agony as he stared, a quiet moment grieving over the lifeless young man. He then tenderly slipped his arms underneath Nine and stood, cradling his best friend's cadaver in his arms, bending his head in sorrow. Five slowly began to walk after the others. The heartbroken coven then began to head home as the smoke engulfed the field. The dead embers, now just meaningless ash, filled the sky around them like snow. End of chapter 26.